First of all, a very warm welcome from my side and also from Dusty and Stefan. We're really happy that you're joining today to this session about green roof policies. And now that we saw that our audience is widely spread all over the world, actually, we're even more happy. Just a short information, and this webinar will be recorded. No faces from your side will be visible, so no worries on that. And thanks to our sponsors, GREENPASS, Netafim and Optigrün, the webinar will be also available online later on our website, so you can rewatch it and share it with your community. About the agenda, first of all, we will get a short introduction on green roof policies in general. Then we have 2 deep dives, first of all in the German-speaking countries, and then a focus on London and on the planning tools. And in the very end, we have a Q&A session and are happy to have a good and fruitful discussion with you. I quickly want to introduce you to the EFB for all those who don't know who the EFB is. So the EFB is the European Federation of Green Roof and Wall Associations, which was founded in 1997 as a non-profit organization. It is the umbrella organization for all green roof and wall associations in Europe. And currently we're counting 15 national associations. And we're strongly also collaborating with different other networks, such as the World Green Infrastructure Network and the So Green Movement and many more. And our speakers today are Dusty Gedge, who is our federation's president and also member of the Green Roof organization GROW, and Stefan Zeller. He is a project work consultant for the German Association of Building Greening book. But I will now hand over the word to our first speaker, Dusty, who can also introduce himself. So Dusty, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Izzy. I've just got to say one technical thing. I'm only seeing 3/4 of the slides. I don't know if that's the case for everybody else.
I'm seeing the slide about you.
Yeah, but I can only see 3/4 of it. Dusty's missing. I can only see Gedge and everything else. But if everybody else is okay, that's fine.
Dusty, you have to close the list of attendees on the left side.
Very good point, Stefan. Very good point. And I've done that now. Sorry about that, everybody. Hopefully there's no more technical glitches. Yeah, I'm the president of the European Federation and a board member of the Green Roof Organisation, which is the UK's trade body, which writes codes of practice. And I set up an organisation over 18 years ago called livingroofs.org to campaign for policies in London and the United Kingdom. So I'm just going to give you a little brief introduction. I'm trying to move the slides. There we go. Yeah. So this is a little introduction into policy because in my experience, when I was researching getting a policy for London, it can depend on what the kind of government you have at a national level. And then I'm going to hand over to Stefan, who's going to go into detail about Germany, Austria and Switzerland, which have some of the longest green roof policies in the world. And then it'll come back to me, and I'm just going to focus in on London and the work that I've done and focus on the developments and planning tools which support policy, and in particular biodiversity net gain and what we call in the United Kingdom the green space factor. It's also called the green area factor or the biotope area factor in Berlin, to show how you can have policies, but if you've got good planning tools, you might make those policies better in terms of implementing. So very quickly, I thought I'd introduce, the Federation was sponsored by the London Mayor to write a report celebrating the London policy. And I've just got a list of cities there from around the world. And there were some figures that I was given from Berlin, a university in Berlin, on green roof area per capita. And if we go to the next slide, what I just want to highlight is most of the cities that are in a kind of a pale green are actually in Germany, Switzerland, or Austria, and those cities have some of the most green roofs in the world. And then there's also cities like Malmo, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam, which have quite significant numbers of green roofs, but they don't necessarily have a distinct policy. They've been delivered through some kind of city incentive program, whereby the city is paying for them, or in the case of Malmo, certainly the Malmo Housing Department has been paying for green roofs to be installed. So though it may appear that they might have a good policy, that's not necessarily the case. And the other thing that I put beside that table is notionally, and this is not absolutely technically correct, but I put F4N. And this is quite relevant to the discussion about policy, because if you're a federal government or of a federal style, so like Switzerland has a cantonal process, but it's very similar to what happens in Germany, actually it's a lot easier to make green roof policies than if you're at what is known as you have a national planning framework where it's run from the central government, which is the case certainly I know in Sweden, in conversations with my colleagues in Sweden, and also in the Netherlands, and certainly in the United Kingdom. It's particular. I was Googling it the other day. Copenhagen actually is run centrally, but they also have the ability to make regional and city policies, which I think is unique for a constitutional monarchy. But that's the best of my knowledge. And the point there is that to make a citywide policy, it may be very difficult if you're run from a central government process rather than from a federal process. And I think when Stefan describes what goes on in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, that may become more apparent. I've got a double slide there. So as I said, it will depend on the type of national government, how green roof policies can be developed in your country. And on that, I'm going to hand over to Stefan to take us through the German, the Swiss, and Austrian approaches. Over to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Dusty. Thank you. I'll just try.
Yeah, let me give you the rights to show. In the meantime, if there are some questions for our speakers, please use the left-sided question window to ask the questions, and we will collect them for later on.
Thank you, Dusty and Isabel. Hello and welcome to everyone as well from my side. I've been introduced already shortly. Yes, my name is Stefan. I'm working for the German Green Building or Building Greening Association. We call it the BUG, the Bundesverband Gebäudegrün, which is probably very difficult for most of you to pronounce. Thank you for the invitation to tell you a little bit about green roof policies in German-speaking countries. And I will here we are. Sorry for that. I will focus first on the situation in Germany, and then also show you some examples from Austria and Switzerland. But as Dusty already explained, as green roof policy depends a lot from the type of government you have. Switzerland, Austria, and Germany have a lot in common. So you will see that a lot of things are done in a similar way in the three countries. Now, let's have a look at these different levels we have. Looking at the different administration levels, we have the federal government or the national government, which does have some impact on on green roof and green wall development through funding, through guidelines, through laws. But if you go further down the lane through the federal states and then cities and municipalities, this is where most can be done to support green infrastructure. Because the cities and municipalities, they control the urban planning in total, and they can make sure that the funding programs and determinations they make that they fit in their overall planning. and they are just much closer to the individuals in each town than the national government. Now, what funding tools, or let's call them tools, instruments, what funding tools do we have to support green infrastructure? We have the direct support, which means funding programs. So, a city or any government can give money to anyone who wants to invest in green infrastructure. And we have the so-called indirect tools, which means we don't give money directly to someone to build a green wall or a green roof, but that includes tools like determination in development plans. It's so-called design statutes, where we can define, how buildings have to be built to fit in the urban planning. It includes regulations in urban land use planning, and it also includes what is done a lot in Germany, the reduction of wastewater charges, which means that people get a reduction in wastewater fee if they have green infrastructure, green roofs, for example. Now, all these indirect tools have in common that they demand something, they encourage people to do it, but they don't finance or don't give direct financial support to individual projects. Now let's have a look at how most of the funding programs in Germany work. And also, I have to say, this also applies to Austria and Switzerland in general. So what are the characteristics of these funding programs? The advantages are each city can define their field of action. So it can be defined exactly how much money do we want to give, what types of roofs or walls do we want to fund, etc. They can define eligibility requirements and criteria for roofs or walls to be built, which means they can, for example, set performance criteria of the green infrastructure. For example, it can be defined that if you plant a green roof, it has to be at least 25 different species on the roof. Or you can define a certain depth of buildup. So you can define the quality that has to be met in order to get public money. And these programs can be applied to new and existing buildings. So you can also encourage people to retrofit their roofs with green infrastructure. The disadvantages of these funding programs are if you want, so it's only an offer. You can offer it, but everyone will decide whether they take the offer or not. It depends a lot on the budget situation because it is public money that has to be spent. So cities that have a very tight budget will have problems to set up funding programs. Also, there's quite a bit work involved, so cities will need additional staff to run these funding programs. So these programs, the disadvantage is they are non-binding and rather high public costs are involved. Now, what are the typical contents of these funding programs? What has to be defined? Of course, first of all, the area. So each city will define in which area can the program apply. Whether that's the whole city or maybe hotspots within the city where they have especially climate problems, etc. It needs to be defined who are the eligible applicants, so who can get money to support their green roofs. These are typically private persons, but also companies, etc., who can demand the support. subject of funding, which means it has to be defined what types of roofs are supported, and then obviously funding levels and costs involved. So, for example, what's the percentage of costs that is paid on top? What budget is available? Many funding programs have a limited budget, which means, if you're late in the year and the budget is already used up, you might not get any further support. Then you will have to tell people, what are exclusion criteria. That could be typically cases in which a green roof has already been installed. So you will not get any money if you ask for it after having installed it. You have to explain the funding procedure. You have to supervise the program, and you might need some marketing activities. So you see, funding programs are quite sophisticated to run, and there's a lot of work involved to get them running. However, many cities do use them, and this is only a very simplified extract from our market research we are doing every year. You can actually download it from our homepage. Just a few figures that might be interesting. In Germany, around a third of the cities have funding programs for green roofs, which means they give direct support. If you look at the larger cities with more than 50,000 inhabitants, it's almost 45% that give direct funding. So this is a tool that does work if the budget is available from the cities. Now, let's have a very brief look at federal state policy. So in Germany, we have 16 federal states. And as you can see on the map, there's quite a concentration of funding programs in one area of Germany. And this is due to special, they call it climate resilience in municipalities, a special program in this area that supports cities to have funding programs. So it's not spread evenly over Germany in terms of funding programs and policy. These programs that are run by the federal states, they are typically focusing on urban climate and rainwater management. And greening of buildings is usually one of the many measures eligible for funding. So they typically include other measures as well. And they also focus on housing development and modernization of houses through state development banks. And in the last 2 years, we have had additional Corona aid programs that also have partly been used to improve local green infrastructure. If we look at the nationwide funding programs that we have in Germany, again, they mainly focus on climate protection measures and adaptation to climate change, in particular green infrastructure. So again, the nationwide programs, they do include green roofs and green walls, but they are just part of the entire program. Some of these programs, they aim to support financially weak cities and municipalities to help them setting up their own funding programs, for example. So the target groups of the nationwide funding programs are typically and mainly municipalities, cities, companies, public institutions, but not really private owners. They will usually use the local funding programs. Now, that was a part of what we call direct funding. There are a few other tools that can be used to improve green infrastructure, which I would call indirect funding, which means they don't support green roof projects by giving money to building owners directly. These are other tools like determination in land use plans, for example. That means anyone building a new house, for example, in the area of Stuttgart, where I'm from, anyone building a new building has to put a green roof on top, as long as it is a flat roof. Also, it's used in so-called design statutes, which means the cities can define how buildings in a certain area have to look and how they have to be designed, and that can also include green roofs. There's also a way to encourage people through regulations in urban land use planning, where you can use green infrastructure to reduce the impact in nature. And what I've already mentioned before, a widespread tool in Germany is the reduction of the so-called split wastewater charges. What it means, if you usually in German cities and towns, you will typically pay a fee for any square meter that is sealed on your ground, which means if you have a non-green roof, you will pay a fee of X amount per square meter, and that fee can be reduced if you put green infrastructure on top of your roof. So a green roof will then help you every year to save these costs, and that is used to encourage people to put green roofs on their buildings. Typical criteria to demand green roofs in development plans are that this is applicable on flat and slightly sloped roofs. So most cities will demand green roofs on flat roofs, but not on highly sloped roofs. The average depth required of these green roof systems is typically around 100 mil or more. Some cities now don't just ask for a certain depth of green roof, but they will also require a certain level of biodiversity, to use native vegetation, to combine photovoltaic and green roofs, for example. And more and more cities now ask for a combination of green roofs and water retention systems. So it gets more and more sophisticated, really. We typically apply what I would call the polluter pays principles. That means green roofs reduce the cost of wastewater disposal, and therefore almost 80% of the cities in Germany will reward green roofs by reducing these charges. And also, as we know, that green roofs mitigate the impact of new buildings. They can be used as a compensation measure, which means they will have to pay less for other compensation measures that might be necessary. Now, I'm coming to the last 2 or 3 slides, just having a brief look at Austria, which also has different, government levels. I think it's 9 federal states in Austria, so we have a similar situation like in Germany. And also in Austria, funding programs are mainly run through the cities. So many cities do have these funding programs like Vienna, Graz, Linz, and so on. So there's a number of cities that does them. For example, in Vienna, they do support and ask for the combination of green roofs in combination with PV panels. So that is a topic that becomes more and more important. Some of these funding programs, they do include costs for expert advice, which is very helpful in my opinion, because the expert advice. Make sure the green roofs are properly planned and installed to really avoid the waste of investment. And yeah, there are some Austrian provinces or federal states, I'm not sure how you call them, they do offer subsidies for green roofs. And yeah, as I mentioned before, like in Germany, the most relevant funding goes really through cities and municipalities. Similar situation in Switzerland. For example, Zurich has a very very helpful funding program. They offer up to 50 Swiss francs for if you convert a gravel roof into a green roof. And you can get up to 30,000 Swiss francs to put a roof in place. And it's limited to 30% of the total costs. So this is also quite interesting to look at these figures, because most cities will give that give support will always demand the owner to pay at least 50% or more of the cost themselves. So it's just it is additional support, but the main costs are usually or typically carried by the building owners. In Zurich, the green roofs are mandatory on new buildings already since 1991, which is almost it's over 30 years now. And it also applies for roofs with solar panels, which means if you put solar panels on your roof, you still have to green that roof surface. They require a minimum of 100 millimeter substrate, as many others do as well. And also Zurich offers free expert advice to make sure the planning and installation can be carried out properly. And in Switzerland, only a few cities and municipalities offer a reduction in wastewater charges. So it's more common in the German market. But there are some cities that offer a reduction in wastewater fee, and that's often up to 50 Swiss centimes per square meter. So over the years, that can almost cover costs for maintenance of green roofs. There is no reduction for new buildings, as on new buildings, rainwater must be retained on site anyway. So the reduction of wastewater fee in Switzerland only applies to existing buildings. So that was my short overview on Germany, Austria, and Switzerland.
Yes.
And I'm now handing over again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I'm now going to take over, and it's back to me. And just as an intro for my little bit that I'm going to come on to, when I was looking at developing or trying to get a policy in London, I spent many years in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria researching how things were done in those three countries. And certainly they've been an inspiration to me. And in a way, this is kind of a contrast to what Stefan's been talking about, because the United Kingdom is not a federal system, and therefore we have Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And over the last 25 years, we have Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have their own administrations, and then we have England. And England is generally run from the centre in terms of its planning policies. And that's the distinction I want to make. And I, as I understand it, it's very, very similar to the Netherlands and the Scandinavian countries. And there's probably a few others. I'm not a complete domain authority on those processes across Europe. And I'll just make a note, because we've got some of the United States of America. So, they have a federal system there too. And in many ways, what happens in the United States of America is not the same as in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, but is similar in terms of how it's articulated. what I was fortunate, or we were fortunate in London, is, and I have to set this in, is that uniquely a new government was set up in London in 2000, which gave it the power to make what is known as the London Plan. So it has had powers which are slightly separate from the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of being able to make policies. And that's why the only city in the United Kingdom up until about 5 years ago had a green roof policy is London, because of its unique government, which in my time going around the European Union said it's actually, and not because I'm a Londoner, is London's quite unique, that it actually delivers green infrastructure well because it's got this new government, which was a government set up for the 21st century. So what I'm going to talk about is London, and celebrate a little bit what London's achieved and compare it to what goes on in the German-speaking countries. But I'm also going to focus on some planning tools that are becoming very, very active in London. And I know there's interest elsewhere in Europe about certainly biodiversity net gain. And obviously the green space factor, the urban greening factor, as we call it, is also used in other cities around Europe. So we managed to campaign to get a London policy in what is known as the London Plan 2008. And then I'm going to tell you about the success of that policy and then the change of that policy in 2021. And the success of the policy really is that the mayor expects all major new developments, so that's very, very large developments, to include green roofs for all the usual things. Adaptation to climate change, biodiversity, stormwater, enhancement of accessible roof space, etc. And they're all listed in the London Plan. This is from 2016. And it's what is known as an expectation, which doesn't mean it's mandatory, but it's actually a burden on the developer to explain why they can't. And that was it in essence. But we have 32 boroughs in London, so we have 32 districts. And over the years from 2008, various districts started to make their own local planning conditions for green roofs, and that'll become apparent as I go through. And in about 2010, we had approximately 200,000 square meters of green roofs in London. Between 2016 and 2017, they increased by about 31%. And you can see the map there. There's a whole series of infographics of every single London borough. That's for the whole of the Greater London Authority, where the green roofs have gone in. And, you know, if you look at the total area in 2020, it is about 2.1 million square meters, which is about a 39% increase since 2017. Now, the uniqueness, and it's not to say what is right or what's wrong, there are no financial incentives. The green roofs just go up through the planning process. One of the issues a city like London has, compared to cities in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, we have no financial mechanism to incentivize retrofitting, putting on existing building stock. And we have a very large building stock in London. There's about 32% of London's building stock could be retrofitted tomorrow. And it's how we could fund that, because London government doesn't necessarily have the financial muscle to be able to fund that. And certainly to take it elsewhere, as I understand it, Paris had a target, I think it was for 100,000 square meters by 2020. That was funded by the Paris government. And certainly the green roofs that have been installed by Rotterdam and I believe by Amsterdam have been funded from the city in a similar way to, comparable to what Stefan's spoken about in terms of how things are done in Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. But London has no incentivizing program for new development either. So, and I think that's relatively unique actually in the world. So if you look at the local districts, and you can see that up at the top there, the City of London is a bit unique. The Tower Hamlets has the most green roofs per citizen, and it had a very, very early planning condition from about prior to 2008 that actually forced this on. And there's a lot of new development goes on in Tower Hamlets. But then you look at one of our outer London boroughs, which is a very rural borough. They only in 2019 set a planning condition for green roofs, and they have the least amount of green roofs if you look at the league table. So the point there is, at the city scale, policy from 2008 has delivered green roofs. At the local level, it's only when there are planning and policies at a local level that green roofs are delivered. And so the key thing, which will come in my conclusion, is policy is key to getting green roofs delivered. But the issue is, in London, I suspect many cities, and certainly not in Austria, Switzerland, and Germany, is quantity doesn't necessarily always equate to quality. So we noticed when Stefan was talking that some cities and municipalities now focus on native and biodiverse planting. They say 100 millimetres. In London, we had what we call supplementary planning guidance, which said we want extensive green roofs, which are 80 to 150 millimetres, planted with native sedums and wildflowers. But there was no policing mechanism. So the application could go through and the green roof was installed. And then you might find that you get very, very poor quality green roofs. And I think that's an issue for a lot of cities around the world, is you can set policies, but how can you ensure what is delivered is what the city, the neighbourhood, the district actually wants? So what I wanted to sort of finish up and round up with, because policy is the starting point, but it's the planning tools. And obviously in Germany, Switzerland, Austria, they have very good planning tools in some cities and some not. And I think it's these planning tools that actually make the delivery of green infrastructure and green roofs and green walls important in terms of delivering the quantity. So the urban greening factor is actually really taken over from the green roof policy that was prior. And people have said to me, oh, there's no green roof policy anymore. I said, no, but we have the urban greening factor. And in a dense urban city like London, certainly in the central zones, to succeed with the urban greening factor, you are more than likely going to have a green roof. So it's a default mechanism in terms of the policy. And if you look at the way that the urban greening factor was written, and I have to say that I partly wrote the report to do it. So, it favours good extensive green roofs, which are can deliver for native biodiversity, but also it very clearly states, which is very, very important, as I will conclude, is that to do anything less than the extensive green roof, if you're just going to use a sedum blanket, it must meet our trade body's compliance, i.e. it must be at least 60 millimetres in depth of substrate, 40 millimetres of depth of substrate with a 20 mil blanket. And I just highlight there's a very good sedum blanket system. It's not my system that I favour. That meets the GROW compliant code. So the urban greening factor scores certain types of vegetation soil, green roofs being one of them, and gives them scores. So when you do your you do your landscape plan, you can calculate whether you're met the 0.4, which is the aspiration for the city, for the Greater London Authority. So in my view, the urban greening factor can help build up the quality. In parallel to that, this is unique to England in the world, and I've already got some people from the Flemish government coming over to talk about biodiversity net gain later on in June. It's the first policy that aims to make developments provide net gain in terms of biodiversity. And obviously, there are developments in rural locations and there's developments in urban locations. And green roofs, there is a metric for green roofs, which I'll come to in a moment. And I certainly see biodiversity net gain outside of London is what's going to drive the uptake of green roofs in cities in England like Manchester, Birmingham, because they don't necessarily have the same ability to make policy like London can. We've got a new planning bill coming through soon, which I am understanding that any city in England will be able to set a green roof policy. And the other thing that's very, very important about biodiversity net gain is there is an obligation for the developer to monitor and demonstrate net gain. And in terms of green roofs, that means that they've got to demonstrate the quality of the green roof. So it's not about quantity now, it's about quality too. And if we look at the metric, these are the metrics for extensive green roofs. and that is the metric that scores the highest. And again, you know, the average depth there is similar to Germany, Switzerland. It's about 100 and 110, and it's very specifically seeded and planted with native wildflowers and sedums. And there's additional features, which is, you know, people who know me is the basis of a lot of my work. But there's also metrics there for sedum roofs, so they score less. And this is part of a whole metric for a whole development site. And my view is it will tend towards the biodiversity extensive green roofs to get the correct score in terms of biodiversity net gain. And finally, there is a metric now for intensive green roofs, and I do want to, and Stefan will probably forget this, but I had the wonderful opportunity to go to Karlsruhe with Stefan. I can't remember what year it was, and Karlsruhe was the first city in the world to actually make a green roof policy. And this is a I took this years ago, I took this directly from the Karlsruhe model, which was a model that was written for the city of Karlsruhe. And basically it says at least 50% native plants and 30% of non-native plants. But what's key is that you need at least 70% of the surface covered with soil and vegetation, which also includes water features. And that's a very, very important metric, because a lot of intensive green roofs that go up, you'll find that sometimes they have 70% hard standing and only 30% vegetation and soil, and that's not really delivering what the city wants. So that's biodiversity net gain. We don't know whether in London the UGF will be successful. My instincts are, because already it's been very, very active, and I've reviewed some of the UGF policies that have come through, and they're generally delivering good urban greening at ground and at roof level, certainly in the city areas. And BNG is also now, it's not actually mandatory yet. It's voluntary at the moment, and it will be mandatory, but already the 32 boroughs are using biodiversity net gain to get more green roofs. But also what's more interesting is some of the very high-end property developers have already aspired to meet biodiversity net gain and are now looking to deliver better green roofs than they have in the past through the usual planning system. So what I'd like to conclude, and I'm sure Stefan would agree, is that policy delivers green roofs. Without policy, it's not going to happen. And the complex approaches in Germany, Austria, and Switzerland and London demonstrate that this can do. But we do need to not focus on quantity, we need to focus on quality, which means that we need good codes of practice in our national at a national level, which all of the European Federation members have codes of practice or normatives. And also we need good planning tools at a city level and maybe even at a national level that demands what the quality of the green roofs are, whether they're extensive or intensive. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I'll hand back to Issy to do all the questions, I suppose.
Yes, I think you still wanted to mention.
Oh, yeah. I did. Yeah, I forgot. Yeah, I'd just like to say on behalf of the Federation, I forgot about this, is the EFB is involved in a number of projects across Europe. And some of those projects are involved in delivering new approaches to policy in the countries and also looking at new business models. Certainly we were out in Portugal as part of the Pro-GI Reg, and we met partners there who are trying to do things. And also, very importantly, the Federation associations are also looking at market reports at a national level. Certainly Austria, Germany and the Czech have already produced them, which get into the granular detail of what is actually happening in those cities in terms of, you know, policy and also the market size and where the market size is focused. And the Federation's mission, it was set up to ensure a healthy green roof and wall industry across Europe. And we, the office, are here to help if we can. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so extending on that, in order to do so, we started our webinar series, and one of those is this one now, but there are some more that have been already done, and you can re-watch them on our website. They are available there. And we also have an upcoming one about green facades, and their effects and basics for planning and implementation coming up in June. But yes, so we still have a quarter of an hour left for some questions. So please throw in all the questions you have. In the meantime, I have one for you, which would be the following. To what extent do you think that the TCFD, TNFD will support greater retrofitting of existing assets? You're muted, Dusty.
Remind me what that acronym stands for. I think this is actually about financial reporting.
It's the Task Force on Nature-related and Climate-related Financial Disclosures.
Yeah. So it's early days, and I've spoken to some real estate people involved in that world, and they say, look, next year it's going to be mandatory to report on biodiversity. This year it's mandatory on climate change. It's very, very complex. My instincts are talking to the real estate community in London who are already looking to retrofit green roofs to meet their ESGs, their environmental sustainability goals. And I just have to say, some of these investors guys that I'm speaking to, we're not just talking about England. They've got investments in Germany, in Switzerland, Austria, Spain, France, that they're really under pressure to look at how they can do this reporting. But my instincts are it's going to take 2 or 3 years for them to actually understand how to do it. It's quite complex. But I do think it will lead to the private sector companies actually looking at this from their own perspective in terms of the reporting that they have to do under those protocols. That's my instincts. I don't know, Stefan, have you got any thoughts on it? Nope. Okay. I hope that whoever asked the question, I hope that helps. It's a very complex thing and above my pay grade, but I am trying to engage with it.
Okay, so we have another question about fire regulation or fire risk. How do we counter the fire risk of vegetation on buildings, which since Grenfell has made greening from balconies impossible?
Well, I suppose I'll have to do that one as well. But I get you in, Stefan, from the work that was done in Stuttgart years ago. Look, so since that major accident and that tragic accident, at a European level and a national level in England, everybody's looking at fire on roofs and facades. And currently in the United Kingdom, we have a UK government document which allows and stipulates the fire situation in terms of green roofs and green walls. And I'll have to Google it in a minute. When I finish the question, I'll put it into the chat. And that is what the building surveyors at local government will do. That is the only documentation. But I am party through the chair of my organisation, who sits on the fire committee and also sits on the European Fire Committee, that we will be moving towards green roofs that will have to be fire tested, and that they will probably have to be 80 mil in depth as a minimum in terms of fire. That's the UK context, but it's pretty similar that these conversations are being had across Europe in terms of fire. And I know that some colleagues in Austria are looking at this. But Stefan, have you got any comments from the German perspective? Because this came up years and years ago, I asking about fire and how fire is described in the FLL, and essentially what is in the UK is what is described in the FLL, which is the German code. Over to you, Stefan.
Yeah, I mean, we do have, the FLL guidelines that include a chapter about fire risk of green roofs. And there are probably 2 comments to make on that. I mean, first of all, there is a definition of how a green roof has to be built in order to be no fire risk. And that mainly refers to the depth of the substrate, but also to the organic content that could potentially burn. And what you can say is that, all the standard systems we have in the market, they are all defined as no fire risk to the building. There's also a testing standard available, so you can run fire tests with any green roof build-up, so that you can prove it is no fire risk through that green roof. In terms of green walls or green facades, as you've mentioned it before, we are in the process at the moment to put a paper together to to put all the information together about fire risk and standards, how to build green walls as well, to make sure there are no fire risk. But especially with green roofs, that's where I'm coming from. It's not a main topic in Germany or the German market, I can say.
Thank you. And yeah, since it's a really important topic and coming up more and more, actually in autumn, the EFB is also planning to do a webinar on fire regulations, especially in context with green facades. So yeah, try to be informed on our website for that upcoming session.
Yeah, if I may, Izzy, I've just put in the under the answered column in questions, I've just put a link to the UK government's fire and green roof performance, which is the current way that we are approaching in the UK, as I understand it. And I certainly can send that to you, Izzy, if you want to send it out to delegates.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then there's another question. Besides promoting green roof for ecosystem functions such as biodiversity or stormwater management, is there any focus in Europe on the social benefits of green roofs? For example, community gardens, edible roof gardens, third-party gardens, etc.
If I want to start on that one, most of the funding programs I know, they would focus on biodiversity, stormwater management, improving urban climate, etc. But there are actually some of these programs, they do include social aspects. And I know there are some programs running from the federal states that actually do focus on projects which improve the social situation within a city, where then green roofs or roof gardens, community gardens can be a part of it. So I would say it is an aspect that does appear in some of the programs, but not as a main focus.
Dusty, do you want to add something on that?
Oh yeah, I keep muting myself and then forgetting to turn myself back on. In terms of London, it's implicit in the policies that health and well-being and use of roof space by people is implicit when you do intensive green roofs. But on a personal note, I've been trying to campaign to allow people, like they can in Berlin, to sit beside biodiverse meadows. Why should they not be able to do that? There's this idea that a biodiverse green roof is not for people. And that's certainly during lockdown, making this reference, is, people wanted to go and sit in meadows and be in touch with nature. And I think they can do that at roof level. But it's implicit in the London plan. And I suspect it's implicit in any city that has a green roof policy where intensive green roofs are part of that delivery of that policy. It may not be specifically about food growing, but it will be about health and well-being.
Perfect, thank you. So far, we don't have any more questions. We just have a really nice comment thanking you for your hard work on policy innovation and advocacy and doing the best to make the world a bit better.
Hey.
So in case someone still has a question, we still have a few more minutes left. And if not, then I think it was a really nice session, really informative for everyone. I want to thank again our sponsors. Oh, I see a question popping up. Okay. One more question. Is there a way to compensate CO2 emissions with green roofs?
There is some research done on that. I don't have the figures in mind. And I know basically you can compensate some CO2 emission by green roofs, but the amount or the quantity is on a rather low level. So I wouldn't really think, although I would like to say that, but I wouldn't really think that by implementing green roofs we cannot really reduce our CO2 impact. Because just the biomass that that will grow on a typical green roof is so little compared to if you look at other types of vegetation, that the effect is rather very low.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that, I think it's 16 grams per year a year, I think, which is not a lot of sequestration. I think to take that question slightly differently is, I think in the long term, we're going to have to look at how we deliver roofs that have less of a carbon impact than they currently do. And I'm talking about transportation and the materials that are used. And I've certainly seen a couple of papers recently on, moving towards analysing green roofs in terms of their carbon, embedded carbon. But I think most industries and most horticultural processes are going to be looking at that over the next 5 to 10 years because it's the way things are going. But in terms of sequestration, green roofs, they're not going to sequester significant amounts to the scale that we need to.
Okay, then one more last question. Is there any differentiation in support between extensive and intensive green roofs?
Is there any differentiation
in support? I guess financial support.
Yeah. So the programs I know, or there are a couple of funding programs we are involved in with German cities. Most of them will have a differentiation. So you will typically get a basic funding or a basic amount for the installation of a extensive roof, for example, with a minimum of 100 mil of substrate. And now many of these programs, they would increase the financial support as you increase the depth of your substrate. But again, as these are all individual programs that each city runs for itself. You will find, in 50 cities, you will find 50 different programs. I can't give you an exact figure, but I would think that at least half of the funding programs do actually give additional support for intensive green roofs.
Dusty, you have
Maybe I have to add to that, sorry, that not only for intensive green roofs, many of these programs especially support what we call the biodiverse roofs, which will typically have between 100 and 150 or 180 millimeter of depth. So this is also a sector which is funded especially through these programs.
Yeah, I think there's a note, and take this in the round, is, it's always been the extensive green roofs, in essence, which are difficult to get put up because they're things that give the city services that are not direct benefit to an individual citizen. An intensive green roof gives an immediate, benefit. So there's a slight difference, and that's why I've always seen it that the support mechanisms for extensive green roofs in the German-speaking country are there because they're more difficult to get put up than intensive green roofs because there's no immediate human value. Does that make sense, Stefan?
Yeah.
And we have one more last question to round it off. Whether you know about studies that are showing the effects of green roofs or types of green roofs in terms of isolation effects?
Isolation effects. I don't know what that is.
Like insulation, sorry.
Insulation.
Yeah.
It probably refers to thermal
Yeah.
insulation, I would assume.
There's plenty of studies that have been done on that. Whether it stacks up in terms of cost benefit analysis is an open question. But we do know that you can get significant savings in terms of cooling during the summertime. And in dry winter, some work done by Dr. Manfred Kuhler showed that in a dry winter in Berlin, there is potential for good winter insulation. But it varies because the system becomes wet. And if it's wet, it's not a good insulator. So that's the way I always try and deal with insulation these days. It gives good summer cooling benefit, but it's difficult to calculate exactly what it gives in the winter because it depends on whether it's a wet winter or a dry winter. Stefan, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, maybe just one more point that especially in Germany, I'm not quite sure what the situation is in the UK, Dusty, but we have very high standards for thermal insulation anyway.
Yeah.
So if you have a new build project where you put like 200, 300 millimeters of insulation on top, the additional effect of a say 80 mil green roof will not be great compared to the 300 mil package of thermal insulation. But we do have buildings. For example, I've been to a warehouse the other day where there's no insulation on that, but they have put a green roof on it, just 90 or 100 millimeters. And the cooling effect in summer is really great because, all the other buildings are heating up in summer, and this building, will still be cold and nice in summer. But this is just because they don't have additional insulation. And the other point is that although we know about the effect, at least in Germany, you can't take the green roof into account. So you still have to put your X amount of insulation on top, whether you have a green roof or not.
Yeah, well, if I may follow you up on that, when we were trying to get the London policy in at that time, and it was 2006 when we was going to what is known as a public examination, and 2004 was the first time that anybody in the UK government had mentioned climate change. And in 2006, we had a heat wave like they had in Paris, and the London government was going, we're not interested in winter insulation, we're interested in summer insulation because, our heat waves are getting increasing. So building on what Stefan says, we have very, very rigorous insulation requirements now. But the green roof in the summertime is an additionality. And then certainly in the context that Stefan shows and on a lot of social housing, which I think is probably the same all over Europe, that was built in the 50s and 60s, summer overheating in the top floors of social housing is a serious issue. And putting the green roof on top of them, just like on the warehouse, can have a significant impact. But traditionally, our focus has always been on winter insulation and not on summer cooling in Northern Europe. It's slightly different in Southern Europe. So I would view the green roof as an additionality, but the existing insulation processes have to be followed, but you'll probably get additional summer cooling if you've got a green roof up there, especially if the climate gets hotter.
Okay. I think some of you might experience that the summers will get hotter for sure in the past few days, especially having high temperatures, at least in Austria today. So yeah, thank you all for joining our today's webinar, and also a special thank you to our sponsors, Netafim, GREENPASS and Optigrün, for making this session possible. And we hope to see all of you very soon in our upcoming session in June, and then later on some more following webinars.